On February 25th, 2005, a Wichita police officer pulled over a gray Jeep Cherokee driven by a 60-year-old man named Dennis Rader. There was nothing remarkable about him. He wasn't carrying a weapon, he wasn't trying to flee, he wasn't living under a false identity or hiding in some remote cabin. In fact, if you had passed him on the street that morning, you probably wouldn't have looked twice. He was a husband, a father, a church council member, a compliance officer known for enforcing neighborhood ordinances. He lived in a modest home, attended community events, and had spent decades building the image of a respectable citizen. Yet within hours, investigators would reveal a shocking truth. It would make headlines around the world. Dennis Rader was BTK. For more than 30 years, he had stalked Wichita from the shadows. He had murdered 10 people, terrorized an entire city, and repeatedly taunted law enforcement while believing he was untouchable. Detectives had chased countless leads. Families had waited decades for answers, and through it all, the killer remained hidden in plain sight. So how did one of America's most elusive serial killers finally get caught? The answer wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't a lucky witness. It wasn't even a breakthrough from decades-old evidence. It was a floppy disk. A simple piece of technology, combined with an ego too large to stay silent, would accomplish what 30 years of investigation could not. This is the story of how BTK's needs for attention became the very thing that destroyed him. Welcome back to Postmortem. Today we're concluding our 3-part series on Dennis Rader, the serial killer known as BTK. Over the last 2 episodes, we've followed the evolution of a killer who spent years hiding behind the mask of normalcy. We examined the violent tendencies that shaped his crimes, the murders that terrorized Wichita, and the carefully crafted double life that allowed him to avoid suspicion for decades. We also explored the growing ego that drove him to communicate with the media and law enforcement, ensuring that the name BTK became permanently etched in true crime history. By the early 1990s, the murders had stopped, the letters had largely disappeared, and investigators had exhausted countless leads, and many people began to believe the case might never be solved. BTK became one of America's most frustrating cold cases, a mystery that seemed destined to remain unanswered. But Dennis Rader had one fatal weakness. He needed attention. No matter how many years passed, he wouldn't let go of the identity he had created for himself. He wanted recognition. He wanted people talking about BTK. He wanted to remind the world that he was still out there. What he didn't realize was that the world had changed while he was busy reliving his past. The technology that didn't exist during his early crimes was now available to investigators. The tools that once limited law enforcement had become far more sophisticated. And when BTK decided to step back into the spotlight, he unknowingly handed detectives exactly what they wanted. Today we'll examine BTK's return, the investigation that finally identified Dennis Rader, and the infamous floppy disk that exposed him. We'll also talk about the arrest that brought one of the longest serial murder investigations in American history to an end. So lock your doors, turn on a light, settle in. Let's get started. When we left off, Dennis Rader had spent years terrorizing Wichita while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary citizen. He stalked victims, carefully planned attacks, and committed a series of murders that left investigators searching for answers. Along the way, he transformed himself into something more than a killer. Through letters, phone calls, and messages to the media, he created the identity of BTK, a name he desperately wanted the public to remember. As the years passed, BTK's confidence grew. Every successful murder and every year he avoided capture reinforced his belief that he was smarter than law enforcement. He built a family, worked regular jobs, attended church, and blended seamlessly into his community. While Wichita searched for a monster, Dennis Rader continued hiding in plain sight. Then something unexpected happened. The murders just stopped. The communications became infrequent, and years passed without major developments. Investigators retired, new detectives took over, residents who had once lived in fear slowly returned to normal life, and for many people, BTK became part of Wichita's past. A terrifying chapter that had never fully been solved. But Dennis Rader had never lost the thing that drove him from the beginning. His ego. The same need for attention that led him to write letters and taunt investigators in the 1970s was still there. Even after decades of silence, he wanted recognition. He wanted people to remember BTK, and in 2004, that desire would lead him to make the worst mistake of his life. For more than 2 decades, BTK was largely silent. The last confirmed murder linked to Dennis Rader had occurred in 1991 with the killing of Dolores Davis. After that, the trail seemed to go cold. There were no major communications, no obvious suspects, and no arrests. To many people, it appeared the BTK had simply disappeared. Whether he had died, moved away, or chosen to stop killing remained a mystery. Then in 2004, everything changed. That year marked the 13th anniversary of the Otero family murders. Media outlets began publishing retrospective stories about the unsolved case, reflecting on the fear that had gripped Wichita decades earlier. Journalists revisited old evidence, interviewed investigators, and discussed the possibility that BTK might never be identified. For most people, these stories were simply a look back at local history. But for Dennis Rader, they were a personal insult. After spending years cultivating the BTK identity, he felt he wasn't receiving the recognition he deserved. Some reports focused heavily on the victims and the investigators rather than on him. Others questioned whether certain crimes were even connected. And to Rader, the attention was inadequate. He wanted the spotlight back. So he decided to reintroduce himself. In March of 2004, a letter arrived at the Wichita Eagle. The message contained information about the BTK murders that had never been publicly released, confirming that it almost certainly came from the killer. The communication immediately reignited public interest in the case and sent shockwaves through law enforcement. BTK was back. For investigators, the letter represented both an opportunity and a threat. On one hand, they were once again hearing directly from the person responsible for years of terror. And on the other hand, the renewed communications created pressure from the media and public, while raising concerns that BTK might begin killing again. What no one realized at the time was that the technology available in 2004 was dramatically different from the technology investigators had relied on in the 70s. DNA science had advanced. Computer forensics had emerged as a powerful investigative tool. Databases and analytical techniques that didn't exist during BTK's early crimes were now available. And Dennis Rader was about to discover that the world had changed while he was busy reliving his glory days. By the early 2000s, the BTK case had become one of the most notorious unsolved serial murder investigations in Kansas history. More than a decade had passed since the murder of Dolores Davis in 1991, and despite years of investigative work, law enforcement still did not know the identity of the man responsible. Some of the original detectives had retired, evidence had been reviewed countless times, and many residents had come to the conclusion that BTK may never be caught. But while the case had grown cold, it had never been forgotten. The victims' families were still searching for answers, investigators continued revisiting evidence whenever new forensic techniques became available, and every few years advancements in technology offered fresh hope that something previously overlooked might finally reveal the killer's identity. Unlike the detectives who first worked the case in the 70s, investigators entering the new millennium had access to tools that were revolutionizing criminal investigations across the country. One of the biggest changes was DNA technology. When BTK committed his earliest murders, DNA profiling didn't exist. Investigators relied heavily on witness statements, fingerprints, physical evidence, and traditional detective work. By the early 2000s, however, forensic science had advanced dramatically. Evidence collected decades earlier could be examined using techniques that detectives could only dream about when the murders first occurred. Law enforcement agencies also benefited from improved databases, digital record systems, and enhanced methods for sharing information between jurisdictions. Cases that once relied on filing cabinets and handwritten reports can now be analyzed using technology capable of identifying patterns and connections far more efficiently. For cold case investigators across the country, these advancements were opening doors that had previously been closed. Despite these improvements, BTK remained frustratingly elusive. The evidence available to investigators was limited by the era in which many of the crimes had occurred. Some physical evidence had deteriorated over time. Witness memories had faded, potential leads had been exhausted years earlier, and while detectives believed the killer might still be alive, they lacked the breakthrough needed to move the case forward. Then something unexpected happened. In 2004, renewed media attention surrounding the 13th anniversary of the Otero family murders brought BTK back into public conversation. Newspapers revisited the case, television stations aired retrospective segments, journalists examined the unanswered questions that still surrounded one of Wichita's darkest chapters. For most people, it was a look back at history, but for Dennis Rader, it was an invitation. and the attention surrounding the anniversary awakened the very thing that had driven him throughout his criminal career: his ego. He had spent decades believing he was smarter than investigators, and now he saw an opportunity to remind everyone that BTK was still out there. What detectives didn't know was that the killer they had been hunting for more than 30 years was preparing to contact them again. And when he did, he would unknowingly set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to his arrest. For years, BTK had remained silent. The murders had stopped, the letters had disappeared, and the investigation had stalled. But in 2004, that silence finally came to an end when a letter arrived that would shock Wichita, reignite a dormant case, and begin the final chapter of the BTK story. When that letter arrived in March of 2004, investigators immediately recognized the significance of the communication. Whoever sent the letter possessed knowledge that only the killer knew, or someone closely to the case knew. After years of silence, BTK had reappeared. As the months passed, additional messages followed. Rader mailed letters, photographs, and packages to media outlets and law enforcement. Some of the communications contained puzzles and cryptic references. Others contained personal details about crimes that had never been released to the public. Each package seemed designed to accomplish two goals: prove that BTK was authentic and guarantee media attention. And for Rader, the communications were exhilarating. He was once again at the center of the story. Television stations discussed his messages, newspapers printed headlines about his return, detectives held press conferences, and after years of feeling forgotten, BTK had successfully forced the world to pay attention. But there was one major difference between 2004 and 1970. When BTK first began sending letters, forensic technology was limited. Investigators often had little choice but to read the communications and hope the killer would eventually make a mistake. Now, every envelope, every stamp, and every package, every document represented potential evidence. Teams of investigators examined everything he sent, looking for even the smallest clue that might reveal his identity. The renewed communication also allowed detectives to study BTK's personality in greater detail. The letters revealed the same arrogance and need for control that had defined him decades earlier. He still viewed himself as the smartest person in the room. He still believed he was manipulating investigators, and perhaps most importantly, he still underestimated the people trying to catch him. As months passed, BTK became increasingly bold. The more attention he received, the more confident he became. He seemed to believe that he could continue communicating indefinitely without consequences. After all, he had gotten away with it for decades. Why would this time be any different? That confidence would soon lead him to ask investigators a question he believed would protect him. Instead, it would become the beginning of the end. Because in his desperate pursuit of attention, Dennis Rader was about to place his trust in the very people who had spent 30 years trying to put him behind bars. And when he did, he would make one of the most infamous mistakes in criminal history. By 2004, the renewed communications between BTK and investigators had taken on an almost cat-and-mouse quality. Dennis Rader viewed the exchange as a game, one in which he was firmly in control. Every letter that made headlines reinforced his belief that he was smarter than law enforcement. Every package that arrived without leading to his arrest boosted his confidence. After more than 30 years of avoiding capture, he had grown comfortable with the idea that he was untouchable. That confidence would prove to be his greatest weakness. As Rader continued sending messages, he became increasingly interested in using newer forms of technology to communicate. The problem was that he didn't fully understand how modern digital forensics worked. While the world had embraced computers, metadata, and electronic records, Rader's understanding of those systems was limited. He viewed technology as a tool he could use, not realizing it could be used against him. In one of his communications, BTK posed a question to investigators. He wanted to know whether a floppy disk could be traced back to its user. Specifically, he asked if it would be safe for him to send information on a floppy disk without revealing his identity. It was a remarkable question, not only because it showed he was considering electronic communication, but because it revealed how much trust he placed in his own ability to outsmart law enforcement. Investigators immediately recognized the opportunity. Rather than warning BTK about the risks, they responded through the media in a way they hoped he would see. The message was simple. A floppy disk would be safe. According to the public response, it could not be traced. It was a lie. Detectives knew there was a chance that electronic media could contain information capable of identifying its creator. More importantly, they suspected BTK's ego might convince him to believe exactly what he wanted to hear. If he trusted the response, he might voluntarily provide investigators with evidence they could never have obtained otherwise. The strategy depended on one thing: Dennis Rader taking the bait. For a man who spent decades believing he was the smartest person involved in this case, the answer seemed reassuring. He had asked a question and received exactly the response he wanted. Rather than treating it with skepticism, he accepted it. The possibility that investigators might intentionally mislead him either never occurred to him or wasn't taken seriously. In hindsight, the moment seems almost unbelievable. A serial killer who had evaded capture for more than 30 years was preparing to trust information provided by the very people hunting him. But that's the danger of arrogance. Over time, confidence can become overconfidence. Success can create blind spots. And BTK had spent so many years getting away with his crimes that he had begun to believe he was incapable of making a mistake. Soon after, a package arrived containing a floppy disk. To Dennis Rader, it was simply another way to communicate to the world. Another opportunity to keep BTK in the headlines, and another move in a game he believed he was winning. To investigators, it was potentially the most important piece of evidence they had received in 3 decades. What they discovered when they examined the disk would change everything. Because hidden within the digital information was a trail that led directly to the man behind BTK. And for the first time in more than 30 years, investigators finally had a name to pursue. When investigators received the floppy disk from BTK, they treated it like any other piece of evidence. On the surface, it didn't appear particularly remarkable. It was simply a standard computer disk containing information that Dennis Rader believed would help him continue communicating anonymously. But unlike the letters and phone calls that had defined much of the BTK investigation, this piece of evidence came from a digital world that left traces most people never considered. As forensic specialists began examining the disk, they weren't just interested in the files it contained. They were interested in everything surrounding those files. The hidden information created when documents are saved, edited, and transferred between computers. This information, known as metadata, can reveal details about a document's history, including usernames, software information, and sometimes even the organization where a file was created. What investigators discovered was astonishing. Embedded within the disk's metadata were references that pointed toward a user named Dennis. Even more importantly, information associated with the files suggested a connection to Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Detectives immediately recognized the significance of the discovery. BTK had spent decades hiding his identity, yet a simple digital oversight had potentially provided investigators with their strongest lead in the history of the case. The church connection became a critical breakthrough. As detectives began examining church records and personal information, one name quickly stood out: Dennis Rader. Not only was he involved with the church, but aspects of his background also aligned with information investigators had gathered over the years. The more they looked into him, the more compelling the connection became. For the first time in more than 30 years, BTK was no longer an unknown figure lurking in the shadows. He was a person, a husband, a father, a church leader, a man living openly in the very community he had terrorized. Investigators moved carefully. Despite the promising lead, they understood the importance of building a case that could withstand scrutiny. They could not risk alerting Rader before gathering sufficient evidence. Surveillance teams quietly monitored his activities. Detectives reviewed decades of investigative material, comparing what they knew about BTK with what they were learning about Dennis Rader. The similarities were impossible to ignore. His age matched, his history matched, his movements aligned with key periods in the investigation. Most importantly, he fit the profile detectives had spent decades constructing. The deeper investigators dug, the more convinced they became that they had finally identified the man behind the BTK letters. But they still needed something stronger than metadata. They needed evidence that could place Dennis Rader directly at the center of the crimes. That evidence would come through DNA. Using a legally obtained familial DNA comparison connected to Rader's family, investigators found a genetic link consistent with the DNA evidence preserved from the BTK case. Combined with the digital evidence, surveillance findings, and decades of investigative work, detectives finally had what they needed. After more than 30 years of fear, frustration, and unanswered questions, the BTK investigation was reaching its conclusion. The man who had spent decades manipulating the media, taunting investigators, and believing he was untouchable had been identified because he trusted a lie and underestimated modern technology. All that remained was the arrest. And on a cold February morning in 2005, one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations would finally come to an end. On the morning of February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader left his home expecting it to be a normal day. For decades, he had successfully balanced 2 lives. One was the life everyone saw, a husband, father, church leader, and community member, and the other was the life he had spent years hiding, the life of BTK. Through murders, letters, and taunts directed at law enforcement, he had managed to avoid capture longer than almost anyone thought possible. What he didn't know was that investigators had been closing in on him for weeks. Law enforcement had carefully built their case, gathering evidence while keeping Rader unaware that he had become the focus of the investigation. Detectives understood that after 30 years, patience was essential. They didn't want a confrontation. They wanted certainty. By the time they were ready to move, they were confident that they had identified the man responsible for terrorizing Wichita for decades. As Rader drove through Park City, Kansas, officers initiated a traffic stop. To anyone passing by, it looked routine. There were no dramatic car chases, no standoffs, no desperate attempts to escape. The man behind the wheel pulled over and cooperated with officers. Then came the moment that ended BTK. After being taken into custody, Rader was informed that investigators believed he was BTK. According to accounts of the arrest and interrogation, he appeared stunned by how quickly law enforcement had connected him to the case. The man who had spent years believing he was in control suddenly realized the game was over. One of the most famous moments came when Rader learned that the floppy disk had led investigators to him. For decades, he had viewed himself as the smartest person in the room. He believed he was manipulating detectives and controlling the investigation. Instead, he had handed them the clue that exposed his identity. The realization was almost unbelievable. After all the years he spent avoiding capture, it wasn't a witness or a dramatic forensic breakthrough that ended his freedom. It was his own ego. As news of the arrest spread, shockwaves moved through Wichita and across the country. Residents who had lived in fear of BTK for decades finally had an answer. The mysterious predator who had haunted the city wasn't a stranger passing through town. He wasn't a criminal mastermind living in secret. He was a man people knew. Neighbors struggled to reconcile the image of Dennis Rader with the crimes attributed to BTK. Members of his church were stunned. Coworkers described him as ordinary. Friends and acquaintances found it difficult to comprehend how someone they had interacted with for years could be responsible for such horrific acts. The arrest forced the public to confront one of the most unsettling realities of the BTK case. Monsters do not always look like monsters. For investigators, the arrest represented the final piece of decades of work. Some detectives had spent entire careers chasing BTK. Others had inherited the case from investigators who never lived to see it solved. The arrest was not just the capture of a serial killer. It was the resolution of one of the most notorious unsolved cases in American criminal history. But while the arrest answered the question of who BTK was, another question remained. Would Dennis Rader confess? After spending decades hiding behind anonymous letters and cryptic messages, would he finally admit to the murders? The answer would come just a few months later inside a Kansas courtroom where BTK would calmly describe crimes that had haunted families and investigators for more than 30 years. And in doing so, he would reveal just how little remorse he felt for the lives he had taken. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader appeared in a Kansas courtroom and did something many serial killers never do. Rather than forcing prosecutors to prove every detail at trial, he pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. For the victims' families, investigators, and residents of Wichita, it was the moment they had waited decades to see. After years of mystery, speculation, and unanswered questions, BTK was finally going to admit what he had done. What followed was one of the most chilling courtroom proceedings in criminal history. As the judge reviewed each murder charge, Rader was asked to explain what had happened. One by one, he calmly described the crimes. There were no visible signs of emotion, no tears, no expressions of guilt or remorse. Instead, he spoke in a matter-of-fact manner, often using language that sounded more like someone discussing a work project than someone confessing to multiple murders. For the families sitting in that courtroom, the experience was devastating. Many had spent decades imagining what they might say to the person responsible for taking their loved ones. Others had hoped that hearing a confession would provide some sense of closure. Instead, they were forced to listen as Rader described some of the darkest moments of their lives with a disturbing level of detachment. The same lack of empathy that had allowed him to commit the murders was now on full display for the world to see. As he recounted the killings, a clear pattern emerged. Rader frequently focused on planning, preparation, and control. He spoke about selecting victims, entering homes, and carrying out attacks in ways that reflected the fantasies he had nurtured for years. The victims themselves often seemed secondary in his descriptions. The focus remained on his actions, his decisions, and his experience of the crimes. Even in confession, the attention remained centered on Dennis Rader. The courtroom also provided a rare glimpse into the disconnect between BTK's public image and the reality of his crimes. For decades, he had hidden behind the appearance of an ordinary citizen. Now, the mask was gone. The husband, father, and church leader was publicly acknowledging that he had spent years stalking and murdering innocent people while living among them. For investigators, the confession confirmed many of the conclusions they had reached over the years. It validated countless hours of investigative work and provided answers to questions that had lingered for decades. In some cases, it clarified details that had never been fully understood. In others, it simply reinforced the horrifying reality of what BTK had done. Perhaps most unsettling was Rader's demeanor throughout the proceedings. Many observers expected some expression of regret or sorrow. Instead, they saw a man who appeared far more interested in discussing the mechanics of the crimes than in the suffering they caused. His calm delivery made the content of his statements even more disturbing. There was no dramatic breakdown, no emotional reckoning, just a serial killer explaining his crimes as if he were recounting events from someone else's life. For the families of the victims, the confession represented something important: certainty. The man responsible had been identified. He had admitted his guilt, and the questions surrounding BTK's identity were finally answered. While no confession could undo the pain caused by the murders, it marked the end of a decades-long search for truth. The next step would be sentencing. And while Kansas law prevented the death penalty from being applied to crimes committed when BTK carried out his murders, Dennis Rader was about to learn that he would never spend another day as a free man. In more than 30 years of controlling the narrative, controlling his victims, and controlling the fear he spread through Wichita, BTK's control was finally coming to an end. On August 18, 2005, Dennis Rader returned to court for sentencing. By that point, there was little uncertainty about the outcome. His guilty pleas had eliminated the need for a trial, and the details of his crime had already been laid bare through his courtroom confessions. The only remaining question was how the justice system would respond to a man who had spent more than 3 decades terrorizing an entire community. Because Kansas did not have a death penalty statute in effect at the time the murders were committed, prosecutors could not seek execution. Instead, Rader faced multiple life sentences. The court ultimately sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars with no realistic possibility of release. For many of the victims' families, the sentence brought a measure of relief, but not necessarily closure. Closure is a word that is often used in true crime, but the reality is much more complicated. No sentence can restore a lost parent, child, sibling, or friend. No courtroom proceeding can erase decades of grief. What the sentencing provided was accountability. For the first time, Dennis Rader was no longer controlling the story. The justice system had taken the control away from him. Throughout the hearing, family members delivered powerful statements about the impact of the murders. They spoke about birthdays missed, milestones lost, and the lasting pain that followed them for decades. Their words served as an important reminder that the BTK case was never really about Dennis Rader. It was about the people whose lives were stolen, and the families forced to live with the consequences of his actions. In the years since his conviction, BTK has remained one of the most studied serial killers in American history. Criminologists, psychologists, investigators, and true crime enthusiasts continue to examine the case, searching for lessons about offender behavior, victim selection, and the psychology of individuals who lead seemingly ordinary lives while committing extraordinary acts of violence. The case is frequently cited as an example of how dangerous assumptions can be. Many people expect evil to be obvious. The BTK case demonstrated that sometimes it hides behind a familiar face. The investigation also highlighted the evolution of forensic science and criminal investigations. When BTK committed his earliest murders, detectives lacked many of the tools available today. By the time he resurfaced in 2004, advancements in technology had fundamentally changed the landscape of law enforcement. The same killer who had successfully operated in the 1970s found himself facing investigative techniques he never anticipated. His downfall became a powerful example of how technological progress can breathe new life into even the coldest of cases. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from the BTK case is the danger of ego. Dennis Rader avoided capture for decades, not because he was a criminal genius, but because of a combination of circumstance, investigative limitations, and his ability to blend into society. In the end, it wasn't a perfect crime that defined his story. It was a mistake. A simple act driven by arrogance and a desire for attention. The very thing he craved most ultimately became the reason he was caught. Today, BTK remains incarcerated, spending his days in prison rather than controlling headlines. The identity he worked so hard to create still exists in books, documentaries, podcasts, and news reports. But while Dennis Rader wanted to be remembered as BTK, the real legacy of this case belongs elsewhere. It belongs to Joseph and Julie Otero, to Josephine and Joseph Jr. Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vianne, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, to Vicky Wagerly, and to Dolores Davis. Their lives were far more important than the man who took them. Over the last 3 episodes, we've followed the story of Dennis Rader from the development of his earliest fantasies to the crimes that terrorized Wichita and the mistake that finally ended his freedom. We've examined the psychology of a man who spent decades hiding in plain sight and the investigation that refused to give up, even when the case seemed impossible to solve. BTK wanted recognition. He wanted fear. He wanted to become a name that people would never forget. And in many ways, he succeeded. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from this series, it's that the story isn't really about him. It's about the victims. It's about the families who spent decades waiting for answers. It's about the investigators who refused to stop searching. And it's about the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones nobody suspects. Thank you for joining me for this 3-part BTK series. For Patreon members, be sure to join me tomorrow for BTK, The Complete Case Files, where we'll take an even deeper dive at the psychology of Dennis Rader, the victims beyond the headlines, investigative details that didn't make it into the main series, and the questions that still remain today. Also, don't forget to take the free Patreon poll. I will put a link to that in the description. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay vigilant.